Welcome to Semiotics and Aesthetics, Part 4, the final part. I'm your guide, Shamini Dias. And in this part, we're looking at semiotics and metaphors. Metaphorical thinking is a semiotic process and a way to build generative countermaps. Now, metaphors we often associate with poetry, but it's not just for poets. Have you ever wondered how many metaphors you use in talking and thinking? Once we get through these slides, you might find yourself noticing and counting. Now, according to George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, our conceptual system comprises metaphorical semantic maps, what Lakoff calls central metaphors. Exploring metaphors can reveal many of our deep-seated semantic structures, and as an aesthetic semiotic process, intentionally creating and exploring metaphors can help us find new stories and counter stories as part of problem solving. Now, if we pay attention to the metaphors we use, they reveal stories about how we make sense of who we are and the world around us. Remember the north and south when we looked at maps, and north was up. Up is good. We say things like, things are looking up, I'm feeling up today, and down is bad when we're sad. You're looking down. Everything just went downhill from there when my business went bust. Metaphors of dark and light work in a similar way. It was a dark day when she left us. We were heartbroken. The dark night of the soul. Or light. She's a bright spark. She lights up the room when she enters. It's no wonder, with this dark light metaphor, colorism exists against darkness and blackness, and it's so prevalent in so many cultures all over the world. Metaphors are truly culturally grounded. So let's take a look at one example, metaphors in our semantic maps for argument. In English, we use the metaphor of war. These sentences that describe arguments, have metaphorical signs of war, indefensible claims, attacking the weak points, being right on target, demolishing an argument, winning, shooting, wiping people out, gaining ground, putting up a good defense, shooting down arguments, the thrust and cut of debates, and of course there's always a winner and a loser. It creates a perspective we embody in thinking and approaching the idea of argument. The story we know and tell are of people locked into an adversarial kind of interaction. Someone must win, and therefore someone must lose. But what if, as Lakoff and Johnson suggest, there was a culture for whom the central metaphor for argument was dance? In this culture, the semiotic map for argument would be of collaborators. The goal is to observe and listen in order to create, to offer different moves, to dissent, but unlike clash, to offer an exchange of different moves, maybe improvise. And we are interested to observe and listen, to support each other in movements that play between balance and imbalance, to discover a rhythm towards some kind of creative synthesis that makes the dance. So this is a very different way of thinking about argument. Imagine the process in a boardroom or a task group if this was our metaphor for argument. So from adversary, opponent, tension, pull, thrust, parry, advantage, disadvantage, win, lose, we might move to partner, collaborator, balance, harmony, movement, development, listen, respond, back and forth, exchange, create, multiple directions. And just by changing the metaphor, we can change a process. So give this a try yourself. Think about communication. For example, you might say good communication is like a tennis game. Then unpack that metaphor. What story does the tennis game metaphor tell? There's a story of not dropping the ball, of hitting the ball back, of keeping the game going. The power dynamics might lie in the game idea. Someone will have the upper hand and win the match. Can you think of a new metaphor for communication here? Something very different. And what beliefs, assumptions, or desires does your metaphor, an alternative to communication is a tennis game, what does it reveal? Now, one important place for metaphors is when we ask, what stories do we tell about our problems? Donald Shawn talks about problem setting and the fact that in just naming the problem, we're framing it, often metaphorically. When we analyze a metaphor we use for something, we surface some of our deep-seated assumptions and values, and by changing our metaphors intentionally, we can build new perspectives that can then become touchstones for new thought and action. Shawn talks about generative metaphors, and he says, when we examine the problem-setting stories being told, it becomes apparent that the framing of problems often depends on the metaphors underlying the stories that generate your problem setting and set the directions for problem solving. Here are two of his examples. So on the left you see the paintbrush, and this is a story of product development researchers, and they were trying to improve the performance of a synthetic bristle paintbrush. It just didn't lay the paint down as well as a natural bristle brush did. When one of them reframed the problem thinking, paintbrush is a kind of pump, isn't it? And then they suddenly found a different way, a different approach to the idea of delivering paint to a surface, and the space between the bristles as channels for the flow of paint. So suddenly the focus was on something else, and they solved the problem and found new ways to think about how to improve a paintbrush. His second example is from social policy and housing. And here, the problem was framed as a story of urban blight. You know, slums, the metaphor of disease, having to remove the cancerous growth, so raise it to the ground and rebuild. But when others reframed the space as networks, creating a different story of community, support systems, and spatial identity, then a completely different approach could be taken. This new story, or we can call it a countermapping, led to community-facilitated innovation. So rather than displace people by removing the blight, there was a more complex coordination of the different stories and perspectives held by municipal officials and by partisans of the squatter settlements. Now, it feels more like a dance rather than an argument, doesn't it? Now, in both of Shawn's examples, there was a restructuring of perception through metaphor. It's not so much that we should think in metaphors. It's important to realize, well, first of all, we do have tacit metaphors or semantic maps within us that frame our thinking and how we even tell the story about what a problem is. But if we can become aware of our framing metaphors, we can restructure our perception, allow new stories, new maps of thought to come into play, which can then disrupt our single story and allow generative thinking, allow other people's metaphorical maps to come into play. And it makes me wonder, if metaphorical thinking is a kind of exaptive process in conceptual mapping. It can happen serendipitously, as in the paintbrush example, somebody just randomly said that, or deliberately mapping, creating a mapping set of conditions to find new patterns, like I set it up for you to think about communication as a tennis game and then asked you to change the metaphor on that, and see what you find. So metaphors are not just for poets. They are an aesthetic, semiotic move to go beyond our normal patterns of stories in order to find new ones. Thank you for traveling with me through parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. That concludes the series. I hope you enjoy the other resources I provided with the transcript. And there are a couple more sections of notes and a whole bunch of references and videos that I hope you enjoy playing with. And I will see you soon at the retreat.